So once again, welcome to our session, and I'm going to go through one of the topics today just to make sure that it's covered, because the podcast covered a little bit of it, but I just wanted to devote some time to talking about it today and kind of navigate where we are in going through Unit 8. So I'm going to be dealing with topic 8.6, which is newly independent states. And basically what you need to know is that global politics and wars created new states in this time period. And if you remember the way I taught you to study for this class, you take the topic page like this. You look at something like this, the topic page, which is 8.6, and the learning objective says, explain how political changes in the period from 1900 to the present led to territorial, demographic, and nationalist developments. So when you look at the historical developments, and the content you need to know, it needs to fit into that learning objective. In other words, you need to know how it explains that, because the questions, as you know, don't come at you about specific things. Like, you don't have to name the country that split from India when it got independence. Rather, if you're asked on an LAQ, evaluate the extent to which political changes led to territorial and demographic shifts after 1900, then you would have to talk about that topic. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to fit this into the way you should know the content here. And we looked at two areas that were partitioned in this time period. That means areas that were cut and separated or divided, and movement of population and any implications of that. And we started this really in the podcast that you listened to last week, and we looked at Indian independence. The podcast dealt with India as an example of a negotiated independence. That's the way Indian independence was dealt with in the historical developments. Just to recall, you need to know one example of a negotiated independence and one example of a bloody revolution or military drive for independence. And the podcast took India under Gandhi as the peaceful negotiated one, and we looked at Algeria as an example of a bloody struggle, a military struggle for independence. You could also fit Vietnam into that as well. But also in the topic of South Asia or India, we have a piece of topic 8.6, and what the topic is the redrawing of political boundaries. So if you remember, Gandhi wanted a unified India when it gained its independence from the British. And the problem was that India, remember, in previous time periods, was ruled by the Mughals, who were Muslim, and they were a minority, ruling over a Hindu majority. And during the Raj, when the British ruled, nobody was in charge except the British. And now that the British are leaving, a lot of Muslims fear that any democracy, Hindus would always win since they were the majority, and Muslims felt like they were going to be repressed. And so there was religious tension. The closer India got to independence, the more these tensions were increased. And finally, when Gandhi wanted to bring complete unity, he was assassinated by a member of his own religion. Another Hindu killed Gandhi because Gandhi was very accepting of the Muslim population, and that didn't do anything to increase the love between these two religious factions. And so what happened was the colony of India, when it got independence, was indeed partitioned. It was cut off. And at the top parts of the subcontinent, you had East and West Pakistan were created. A country that was divided in two places. East and West Pakistan was created. And this was going to be, Pakistan was going to be Muslim, India was going to be Hindu, and that meant people from living in India who were Muslim wanted to get out of there. A lot of them did, and they went into Pakistan. And Hindus in what would become Pakistan wanted to go into India, where they would be in a Hindu government. And I think I mentioned in the podcast, as these people were literally passing on the roads, there was a great deal of violence back and forth between them. But India was partitioned into East and West Pakistan, and then when East Pakistan began to pine for independence a couple decades later, India kind of pushed them to get independence, thinking it would weaken Pakistan, and they created Bangladesh. So East Pakistan stopped being Pakistan, and now you just have Greater Pakistan today, which fears that India wants to annex them and bring them back in. And the disputed region of Kashmir is pretty controversial even today between India and Pakistan. So that partitioning, look, you have a partitioning, you have a movement of population. In this case, the movement of population was driven by religious factions between Muslims and Hindus. So that satisfies that learning objective. How did political changes in the period from 1900 to the present lead to territorial and demographic developments? There's a great example of it. So just understand how the question might come to you on the AP test. The other example is in the Middle East. Remember going back to World War I, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany. They sided with a losing side, and at the Treaty of Versailles, at the Peace Conference of Versailles, the Ottoman Empire was broken apart by France and Britain and basically colonized or turned into mandates. The section of Palestine, this is the Roman name for that province. It's not an ethnic group, it's just a place, Palestine. Palestine was given to the League of Nations as a mandate, but eventually the British got that. And what happened between World War I and World War II is that Jews were allowed to leave Europe and go settle into Palestine, and it caused tensions with the Arabs there. The Arabs who had helped Britain in World War I by rebelling against the Ottomans to weaken them from the inside, they thought that they had been betrayed by the British because the British didn't give them a nation. They gave the Turks a nation, Turkey, but the Palestinians, the Arabs there, did not get a nation. They got many of them ejected from their homes as Jews moving in, especially as anti-Semitism and fascists came to power in Europe. And Hitler didn't hide what he wanted to do. He wrote it in his book, Mein Kampf, in the early 1920s. But the Jews who could afford began to migrate, and this was their ancestral, historical home. And so they began to move into Palestine and move Arabs out. And this caused tension as well. Now what happens, you have World War II. And after World War II, there was immense sympathy for Jews, which of course they deserved after the Holocaust. And the United States was very sympathetic to the Jewish settlements in Palestine, and President Truman and other leaders of the global community decided to give them a nation. And so they created the State of Israel in 1948. And for the Palestinians, many of which were still living in settlements outside of the land that they lived in for 2,000 years almost, this was the last straw. I mean, they felt like we're never going to get back to the lands that were taken from us. They settled in. They were pushed to the places called the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in Palestine. So this intention, or this intensity that was driven in somewhat by religious, you have Jews and Muslims, but also just this delayed sense of nationalism and sense of betrayal led to this. So Israel became a state. And in the last podcast, I talked about a very important leader in Egypt called Nasser, Gamal Nasser. And you do need to know about him. He was a strong leader of Egypt. The Suez Crisis happened under Nasser. Nasser decided to snuff this little state of Israel out of existence right away. And when Israel was declared a nation in 1948, nations around Israel, the Arab states around Israel, tried to destroy it, and Israel held its own. I mean, they stayed and defended itself. And then there were several attempts to end this what the Arabs called this illegal occupation of our territory. And in 1967, Nasser led this pan-Arab movement, pan meaning across. That means Arabs in several states surrounding Israel moved their armies into Israel, and in 1967 they attacked Israel on the same day. And again, their goal was to destroy them. Nasser was a hero of the Middle East for the way he stood up to the U.S. and the way he stood up to the French and the British after the Suez Crisis. So the Arab states attacked Israel, and this is known in history as the Six-Day War. And you can imagine why, because it was over in 6 days. Israel defeated all their enemies and pushed them back after 6 days of fighting. But they didn't just push them back to the original borders. Israel moved and took more land. They took the Sinai Peninsula, which is near the Red Sea, part of Egypt. They took that. And so this made this very controversial. Nasser was humiliated. Pan-Arabism was kind of weak. Israel stood its own and stood up to this invasion. And then there was a second attempt in 1973 on the Jewish holiday known as Yom Kippur. And this is called the Yom Kippur War. So Israel was attacked again by its Arab neighbors. And once again, Israel defeated them all. And there was a sense of rage among the Arabs for this. If you think about this tension, both the Palestinian Arabs, who are Muslims, and the Jews in the state of Israel have very legitimate grievances. They both have a sense of victimization because they were victims. This isn't some projected victimization. Arabs were betrayed in World War I, and instead of getting a nation as they were promised, they lost their home. Nazi Germany tried to extinguish the Jewish race. And so after the Holocaust, you have this incredible sympathy for the Jews. So it looks as if this situation has no solution. After the failed attempt in 1973, I mean, this is several attempts now to distinguish Israel, the rage in the Arab world was directed at the United States because Israel was the recipient of an enormous amount of U.S. financial and military aid. And the response this time was the Arab states, many of them produced oil. They formed an organization called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. And the Arab states used OPEC, an oil-producing conglomerate of nations, to try to punish the United States. And they boycotted the sale of oil to the U.S. to really hit the U.S. economically, and it did. This is the 70s, and the U.S. economy went into a tailspin. By the way, the U.S. was fighting in Vietnam at this time, and it was a low point in the history of the United States, where gas prices soared. There was rationing of gasoline. You could only buy, I think, $5 at a time, and you could only buy on certain days. It was just, to my knowledge, has never ever happened in the world before, maybe, or in the U.S., maybe during World War II. But the U.S. economy and its prestige in the world was greatly limited. But the U.S. just sought oil in Canada and built a pipeline to Canada. And the Arab world realized that you don't really cut supplies to one of your biggest customers. Remember, the Confederacy did this. During the Civil War, they stopped selling cotton to Britain, hoping it would twist Britain's arm into joining the Confederate South in the Civil War. And all the Brits did was look to India and Egypt for their cotton. So the U.S. did a similar thing. By the way, what comes out of this is a failed sense of pan-Arabism, this nationalism that stretched across Arab states. Pan-Arabism failed because it could not take Israel. And the next president of Egypt after Nasser, it was Sadat. Sadat met with U.S. President Jimmy Carter and officially agreed to accept the existence of Israel. The government of Egypt caved in and said, we will accept Israel's existence, shook hands with Carter, and not too much longer after that, Sadat was assassinated by an Egyptian for having betrayed the Arabs in the world by accepting Israel. So this became controversial. And by the way, this is really where the roots of international Islamic terrorism lie. In the Treaty of Versailles, which betrayed Arabs, and in the continued existence of Israel, which even bin Laden, in his famous declaration of war against the U.S., his fatwa against the U.S. in 1998, said his biggest grievances were the U.S. support of Israel. And at the time, U.S. had military bases in Saudi Arabia. And here's the roots of 9/11, by the way. It kind of all comes together. All right, so Israel is another example of a partitioned area and a movement of populations as Jews resettled into the Roman province of Palestine, which used to be part of the Ottoman Empire and became a mandate after World War I, and then Israel got its own nation. All right, the only other thing in topic 8.6, because the learning objective is not only that you have territorial and demographic nationalist developments, but demographic developments. And I dealt with this in the podcast or in the last video session, where you have a new pattern of migration. And the pattern of migration during this post-colonial time, as all these colonies become their own nations, is a pattern of migration that goes from former colonies to the big cities of the nations that used to control them. So, for example, Algerians are going to go and migrate to Paris. It was a former French colony. South Asians, both from Pakistan and India, when India got its independence, Pakistanians and Indians migrated to London, and there are areas of London that have large populations of South Asians. So this is a new pattern of migration that you have in the 20th century with decolonization. Compare that to migrations in the last time period, where you have rural to urban in places like England for factory work, or you have from China or Ireland to the United States for factory work, or indentured servants taking the place of what slaves used to do in sugar plantations in the Caribbean. So that is 8.6. What we're going to do next is on the schedule, you will read in AMSCO 8.7. So I'm leaving 8.7 up to you, and that you will annotate that one. 8.8 is the end of the Cold War, and I have a video that I made last year that I'm going to show to you. And you can of course feel free to look at AMSCO, but the end of the Cold War video, it's one of those. If you watch the DBQ videos, those are from last year. I did like a cooking with Hindi kind of mock thing, and the end of the Cold War video is similar to that, but it gives very succinctly the things that led to the Cold War and the rise of globalization, which is what Unit 9 is all about. 9 is globalization, and it's the last unit in this course. So we are looking to finish this course by spring break, the content, and that gives us about a month after spring break for solid reviews on the 4 different time periods. And then you're all ready for the AP test. So thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.